Hey everybody, today I'm talking about my top 10 most brutal and cutthroat board games. So these are games where you need to be prepared to get a bit nasty in order to overcome your opponents. Now, a few caveats on this list. Number one, I have completely avoided any social deduction style games because that's part and parcel with those designs. And the same goes with like war games. And I've also made a note that all these are games I actually enjoy. There are some games I would consider higher or would have made the list, but I didn't like them. So I've excluded them from the list, but I will mention them after my personal top 10. Now, before I get into the top 10, I want to give a shout out to the show's sponsor, KIENDA.co.uk, who are my go-to online retailer. And if you use the link in the show notes or the QR code, then you can get 5% off your first order. At number 10, I have Tifa Tashin, also known as Good Critters. I'm going to talk about Tifa Tashin because that's the version I have, and I think the more realistic, kind of political theme suits the game better and it makes it feel more cutthroat. So this is a negotiation style game where there's going to be a president, and it's up to the president to divide these money cards out amongst all the players, and they can divide them however they see fit. They can give it all to one player, they can give it to themselves, and divide it equally, whatever they want. And once the president is satisfied how he has divided out that money, all the other players are going to choose a card in their hand and reveal them simultaneously with the other players, and those actions will kind of change the landscape. So some of them might say, I support the president's choice because I'm getting a lot of money, so I want to keep him in power. Some might say, well, I'm going to try overthrow the president, and if there's enough of those votes, then the president is going to get kicked out of the round and the president is going to move on to the next player. You can blackmail people or counter blackmail people by using this kind of double bluff mechanism, or you can even skim money from the top of the cash deck as long as you are the first player to do that. And because this is a free-for-all negotiation game, you can all kind of conspire with each other to try and work out things to suit you. And of course, because the money cannot be divided up equally, then people are going to get locked out. And as long as you have the majority, you might stay in power. But these people who've been locked out might try to rope in other people and convince them to join their team, and even try to bribe them. So you can imagine all the little cliques and little subdivision that goes on here, and the collusion and so on. It is a brutal game, it's vicious. I wish I could play it more because it does require higher player counts. But it's not a social deduction game, but it's social deduction almost adjacent. And it is just so good. And I wish the original theme, the Tifa Tashin theme, was distributed widely rather than it being kind of cartoony with the reprint, because it just ups the tension even more. But I love this one, but it is so mean. That is Tifa Tashin at number 10. At number 9, I have Mexica. Now this is a more traditional area control style game where you have a basic board to start with, but as the game progresses, you are placing these river tiles on the board to carve up the board and create regions where you are competing for influence by means of placing these temples. Now, because you are creating these regions yourself, players might spend quite a bit of effort to almost complete a region, then somebody else might sneak in there and finish it off, which can be very frustrating. And also, because of the way the influence works, players might spend just enough to win the region, and then the next player will come along, sneak in there, and then place just one more than the previous person. So there's this constant kind of nibbling at each other to try and get these majorities. But where the real cutthroat nature of the game comes through is when the board starts to get quite populated, you can block other people's pieces in so they can't move at all, or you can kind of move bridges away from them, so it's going to cost them more action points in order to move around and be more efficient. And yeah, those little things can really determine who the victor or the loser is. And also, you don't even have to have certain regions in order to score points, and people might spend a bit of effort to build these temples in these kind of neutral regions, and then you can build kind of a river around their region to make that region worth fewer points than it would have been worth. So everything here is, again, very cutthroat. You need to be on the ball, you need to be hyper alert to make sure that you're being efficient and to kind of put little blockades in front of your opponent whenever you can. So that is Mexica at number 9. At number 8, I have Manhattan. So this is an older area control game where you are trying to build these skyscrapers in these 6 different cities. All you're doing on your turn is that you're playing a card which will show a location where you can place one of your skyscrapers. But the problem is with these skyscrapers, just because they're on the map, it doesn't mean they're necessarily yours for the remainder of the game, because if your opponent chooses to build on top of you and has a the kind of layers or the levels of a building equal or more than you, then they can build on top of you and take that building for themselves. And what you're doing is that you are competing for majorities. You're competing for every single building you have. You're competing to have the highest tower and so on. And this game really does become almost petty in a way. When you get into a bit of a dispute with another player, you'll just do whatever you can to try and take over their buildings. And I think maybe the reason why this game ended up on this list was because whenever I play this game, I'm always the target of everybody's aggression. Now, I don't mind it. It's very funny. It's a very simple game, and it's actually quite light-hearted. But if you play it with a like-minded group and you do get competitive, then it can be, claws out, and every single opportunity you'll try and shaft your opponents and steal their buildings. But a lot of fun, but with a pretty vicious streak. That is Manhattan at number 8. At number 7, I have Hansa to Tonica, one of my favourite games of all time, actually. And the way this game is so cutthroat is because the board is just not big enough to hold everybody's pieces. So if you're not familiar with Hansa to Tonica, it's a root building style game where you're placing your pieces on the board, trying to connect two places together. And when you do that, you can kind of cash them in and put some influence in these buildings. Now, the problem is that people can deliberately get in your way, meaning that you have to spend additional actions to bump them out of your way. And not only is that frustrating for you because it slows you down, they also get a reward for doing that. So the game actually encourages you to get into each other's way. And of course, when you get bumped off, you can bump off into other people's way, and then they'll bump you off again. You can spread even further, and so on. So whatever you do, you're going to get in each other's way in this one. It's always described as kind of a knife fight in a phone booth because, again, you can't move without getting or rubbing shoulders with the other players. A constant back and forth on who's controlling those regions. When you take certain actions in terms to build up your engine, you could be giving other people's points. Sometimes you might not want to do that and just not go to those places just out of spite, even though you really do want that action. So when the higher player counts come into play with this game, it does get very cutthroat, and you want to be super efficient, and sometimes you'll take moves just to be petty and just to spite the other players rather than actually helping yourself. It might help yourself a bit later, but a lot of the time you'll just take turns just to get in your opponent's way, which is always funny. So that is Hansa to Tonica at number 7. At number 6, I have Babel. So I was actually trying to avoid putting 2-player only games on the list because with 2-player only games, of course, you're going to try and hurt your opponent because they are your direct and only competition, and damage to them is going to hurt you. But Babel is so brutal that I could not avoid putting it on the list because straight from the get-go, your objective here is to not only help yourself, but to directly hurt your opponent. So this is kind of a tower building style game where you're trying to construct these towers on different locations by playing these cards. Now, whenever you play a certain number of these cards in order, then you'll get to use a pretty horrendous ability to hurt your opponent, such as tearing their tower down in that location, or converting their troops into your own, or getting rid of their troops completely. So you're always not only trying to help yourself, but equally trying to hurt your opponent and slow them down. And you get straight from the go here, you're punching your opponent in the face, and it's going to be, whoever is the nastiest and whoever can hurt your opponent more will probably win this one. So notoriously known as one of the meanest games out there, which is quite interesting considering it is a Uwe Rosenberg design. But I love it, I love it, I love it. But, you do need to know what you're getting into when you play Babel. So that is Babel at number 6. At number 5, I have Photosynthesis. So I think the reason this one came higher on the list was because how disarming it is. Because when you look at it, it looks like a very pleasant game where you're just building up this little woodland by placing these trees and growing them and so on. In actuality, it is a vicious abstract strategy game where you are, again, trying to plant these trees on this circular board. And you need your share of the sunlight. So each round there's going to be a sun that rotates around the board, and the sun is going to, of course, shine on the trees, come from a certain direction. If you are exposed to the sun, then you're going to get growth points and start enhancing your trees. But if you are in the shadow of your own or other players' trees, then you'll get nothing. And of course, as the game progresses, you want to start placing your trees not only to help yourself, but to put as many of your opponent's trees in your shade as possible. You'll even deliberately leave trees in place that you could probably harness and start getting points for, just to annoy your opponents. Again, it gets very, very tight. The board is very small. There's not much maneuverability. So every placement matters. Sometimes you can completely starve your opponent of light. And again, because it is so pleasant to look at, the vibe of the game, you just look at it and think, this is going to be a nice, breezy, relaxing game. And that is not the truth at all. It is very, very mean, especially if you play with that spirit. So that is Photosynthesis at number 5. Okay, so let's move on to number 4. And I think this is where it starts to amp up again in terms of the cutthroat nature and the brutality of these games. So at number 4, I have Caelus. So Caelus is one of the original worker placement style games. Simple resource management, collect resources, contribute to the church and get points. Now the problem with this game is that, well, the main part of the game is that each round there's going to be more kind of buildings put on this track. Basically all the worker placement spots are on this road essentially. And there is a piece called the Provost. And the Provost is this pawn that's going to move up and down the road at the mercy of the players, and the particular worker placement spot gives you a lot of jurisdiction over how the Provost moves. But any placement after the Provost is not going to activate. And what this will normally mean is that some players will put a lot of investment into planning all their actions, all the resources they need. Then another player will go onto the Provost spot and move it further this way so that all their efforts are completely nullified and they'll get nothing that turn. It is so tense, and typically all the actions you want are right on that borderline where the Provost is. There's conspiring with the other players, because if there's a runaway leader and they are taking all the spots to the right of the Provost, the other players will say, you know what, let's move it this way a bit and just stop them doing anything this round. It is really quite hurtful actually when people take that action. It completely just cuts your legs out from under you. But it is, again, it is part of what the game is all about. And there's also some additional wrinkles that you can use to hurt your opponents financially. For example, if you pass for the round, but your opponent wants to keep going, they have to spend more money per worker for each additional placement in relation to everybody else who has dropped out. So if you know that your opponent really needs to do something and you're somewhat not that interested in this round, you can do without it. You can drop out early and force your opponent to drop out because they cannot afford to go on any longer. One of the original worker placement games, still one of the best, but that Provost piece is going to be very, very polarizing. I'm sure if people get shafted by the Provost and weren't really expecting it, that might make them very salty and they won't play the game again. But like with all these games, if you know what you're getting into, it can be a lot of fun despite the brutal nature of it. So that is Caelus at number 4. At number 3, I have Barrage. So this is a unique Euro strategy economic game, to say the least. It's a game all about trying to capture water and turn that water into energy. And as with the real kind of water system, it takes the least passive resistance, goes from the top of the mountain, flows down this mountain range, getting caught in dams, hopefully your own dams. But the way the board is designed just lends itself to a lot of interaction and a lot of pretty mean and cutthroat interaction at that, because the cheaper spots on the board are towards the bottom of the mountain, where you can build up your infrastructure of your kind of power stations and your little turbines and your dams. But because, again, the water flows from the top to the bottom, as the game progresses, somebody else might build a dam just above your little engine or your infrastructure to completely cut you out of the game and render that dam completely useless. Yes, it's expensive to do so, but the investment might be worth it. So it's all about trying to cut the legs out from under your opponent, to block them off, to divert this water to suit you, and to guide it away from your opponents. And not only is the board state hyper cutthroat, every single placement matters, you need to very meticulously plan things, but the actual scarcity of the actions you want to take is cutthroat as well, because the worker placement spots where you're using to take your turns quickly dry up, so there is a real turn angst to get to every single action you want. But to be honest, all the interaction and the main part of the game, the meanness, does come from the board itself and trying to build higher up that mountain to capture every single droplet for yourself and to bleed your opponents dry. Still, if you played this game, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It is, again, sharpen your claws from the get-go. That is Barrage at number 3. At number 2, I have Arboretum. Now, this is a card game, and it somewhat fits in the same camp or category of games like Photosynthesis, where on the surface it looks very peaceful and pleasant, because it's all about building an arboretum full of trees, but in reality it is horrendous. So this is a game where you're trying to manage a hand of cards to build a little tableau of trees in front of you, trying to create pathways of numbers to score victory points. Sounds very simple. Now, where this game is amped up in terms of its brutality is the fact that cards in your hand are very important, because if you have the majority or one of the suits of cards or the tree types in your hand, then you are the only player who's going to score that particular type. And what this means is that if your opponent puts a lot of effort into creating a huge network of trees in their little tableau, they think they're going to get a lot of points, they probably kept a couple of cards back, but you have one or more trees than they do, or total value of trees than they do of that particular type, then you are going to stop them scoring that category at all. And because the way the numbers are paced at different values, you can trump your opponent without them even realizing you're doing it. And when it comes to the big reveal at the end of the game about who's got what in their hand, then it can completely just blow the wind out of your sails, thinking, you know what, my whole game depended on me having the majority of that type, and you spitefully kept them in your hand just so I couldn't score them. Now, the interesting thing about this game is not only that, but the fact that you do have a limited size of hand size. I think it's only 7 cards in your hand. So if you want to be that mean, you are going to almost spite yourself, because the cards you're keeping are blocking up your hand and limiting your scoring options. But sometimes it is the right decision to make, and you can win this game by hurting your opponents. And you can even win this game on a very low value of points for that reason. By far the most brutal card game I've ever played. Again, if you've played this game, you'll know what I'm talking about. It is pretty damn horrible, but in a great way, because it's a great design. That is Arboretum at number 2. And finally, at number 1, and to be honest, this is quite a distant number 1, this is The Estates. So The Estates, by far, the most cutthroat, the most mean and nasty game that I have ever played. It's an auction, an economic style game where you are spending cash with a closed economy, actually, so no money is ever introduced into the game. And you are using this cash in order to auction or bid for these different buildings and rooftops and things, and you are basically investing and taking ownership of certain companies and trying to score points based on the height of these buildings or the strength of these buildings, essentially. Now, the twist on this game is that the buildings will not score anything unless they complete that row. So people are investing in things, trying to make sure that they fill a complete row up and meet this kind of border. If that happens, then they're all going to be eligible for positive points. Great. Now, the problem is that you can invest in expanding that border. So if players heavily invest in a particular building type or a row of these buildings, then you might think, you know what? Let's just keep extending the border, getting them more and more negative points as they go. And that's a really kind of viable strategy to do that. In fact, that's a key decision in the game. It's a very careful balancing act, because you don't want to be the sole occupant of a particular row, because then the other players are going to conspire against you and make sure that you do not score those points, meaning that you want to somewhat blend or mix with the other players to make sure you all have a kind of horse in the race, really. Otherwise you are going to get shafted by the other players. But still, this is so mean when you've spent the whole game investing in a bunch of buildings and you end on negative 50 points because the other players have been so horrible and just kept extending that borderline so that you could not finish any buildings. It's a great design, but I do need to be in the right mood to play it. another game where you're going into it with the mindset of, you know what, let's all be friends now and all agree to be friends at the end of the game, but during the game, all bets are off. I'm going to do whatever I can to win it. I highly recommend everybody plays this game at least once. I'm sure some people will bounce off it hard because of the cutthroat nature of it. Some people are going to love it, but I think you need to experience it at least once just to see if you've got it in you to hang with the big boys and play a game like The Estates. So that is The Estates at number 1. So there we have it, that concludes the top 10 games. Let's just give some honourable mentions now. So Food Chain Magnate, brutal game, but I didn't like it, so hence why I didn't make the list. Renature, another very cutthroat area control style game. Games like Libertalia I considered. Citadels can be mean. Lifeboat was another very mean one. Some of the games I hadn't played that I probably would make this list if I had played them, because they are widely considered to be brutal. Games like Game of Thrones, games like Diplomacy. But other ones I considered were Pinata was another 2-player game that can be very mean because you can deliberately sabotage your opponent's scoring. Emotep was another one as well, where you can try and divert your opponent's points to the wrong regions where they don't want to go to. And even games like Tigris and Euphrates I considered as well. But these ones didn't quite make the top 10, and I'm quite happy with this top 10 actually, albeit they might be in a different order if my mind changed. But hopefully you have enjoyed the video. If you have, please be sure to hit like and subscribe to the channel and check out my other content too. But for everybody else, I'll see you next time on Chairman of the Board. Bye bye.